Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, welcome back to Divergent Conversations. We're continuing our OCD series today, and we have a really cool guest. Aiden, I never asked you how I say your last name, so I'm going to
Reis.
Reis.
Yeah.
Aiden Reis. I am so jet lagged, y'all. So reading the bio is not my strong suit right now. Aiden Reis is a trans and autistic private practice therapist based in Massachusetts, working with the autistic and ADHD clients. He is passionate about providing neurodivergent-affirming and LGBTQ positive therapy. He specializes in OCD, anxiety, phobias, and panic. Aiden is a member of the International OCD Foundation, and we are really excited to have you on here today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really exciting to talk.
Megan, do you want to introduce what we're talking about? Because
Yeah, I mean, I was going to see if we wanted more context for Aiden, but that's also a hard question. I'm going to hot potato it to you, Aiden, and you can either pick it up or not. Is there any other context for our listeners that you'd like to share about kind of who you are as a therapist or how you come into this conversation?
Yeah, definitely. So as Patrick was saying, I'm autistic myself, but I don't have OCD. But when I was like early on as a therapist in community mental health, I was working with a lot of autistic clients, just kind of naturally drawn to that population, of course, even though I didn't know it at the time why. And then it kind of seemed like OCD kept coming up over and over again. And I would go to my supervisor and say, okay, what should I do here? And she wasn't trained what to do with OCD, so she couldn't help me. And I was really new. And she would just say, like, refer out. But that was like the most motivating thing she could have said to me to get trained, because I didn't want to refer out these clients who had so much like attachment disruption already. And I was really connecting with in so many other ways.
I love that. That's such a beautiful responsiveness. I absolutely have seen that a lot too, of like, most of us, maybe that's an exaggeration, but many of us also have OCD. But especially because do you work with the neuroqueer population? So especially when it's like, I feel like so often neuroqueer clients particularly are like having to choose between like someone who gets my identity, someone who specializes in the thing I'm struggling with. So for you to go out and be like, no, I'm going to figure out how to do this. I have do you ever get the like tingly feelings of like goodness? I have that right now. I just think that's really beautiful. And I've seen a few therapists do that, and I just think it's really lovely to respond to the need you're seeing by kind of leveling up training.
Absolutely.
And then autism, is that a newer in life discovery for you? Like since being a therapist? Okay.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of years ago. I was actually diagnosed with a learning disability as a child, and kind of put under the like NVLD category. And then
Common.
and then I was like looking later at that paperwork, like, okay, what did that even say? And it was like, this is just a description of autism.
I've heard that about NVLD before, and now it's obviously in the news a lot because of Tom Waltz's son. And people have been asking me to make a diagram for that for years, and I should probably go do that because there's so much similarities. Okay. So, and then you do, and I'm excited to talk about exposure because I think exposure gets kind of a bad rap, and I actually feel bad. I feel like I contributed to that in some of my early work. But actually exposure is really helpful for anxiety. So you do exposure response prevention for OCD, but you adapt it for neurodivergent clients. Do I have that right?
Exactly. Yeah. I'd say I'm really ACT informed. I think that was really helpful in starting to adapt because I think the values piece, so many people connect so well with that. And there's a lot of other pieces too, but so I'd say really ACT informed ERP, and then adapting even further past just adding in the compassion and values from ACT, but going further to making it friendly specifically.
I love that. I draw on ACT a lot. I really like ACT. I think it feels very gentle. And I do love how values aligned it is. I am blanking. Tara Vance has an article I really like, and the title is something like "Autistic people don't have values. We are our values."
Yeah.
Just
It's
that
so
how it's so key to our identity. So I think an approach that helps us be value aligned while holding hard emotions, like it holds that paradox.
Yeah.
I found the most healing in my anxiety and in a lot of my mental health through that framework, as well as psychodynamic stuff. But
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, did you have a thought or
I had a thought, but it escaped me.
I wanted
that
to
happens when,
real
oh,
quick. I like that we're having you on to talk about ERP or exposure response prevention. For those of you listening, from a neurodivergent-affirming lens, because again, like Megan said, getting a bad rap in a lot of circles, but we also had someone on recently who did the same thing for our listeners with the EMDR, which also gets a bad rap. I think she did a really fantastic job of saying, like, individualizing, taking into account people's backgrounds, cultures, their identities, really ensuring that this is not a black and white protocol. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like how you all talked about like finding the access point. What's going to help someone access this tool that we already know works for lots of other people, but it's not always so accessible right off the gate.
yeah.
Yeah. And
Oh, go ahead. I keep doing that to you.
no, it's all good. You were saying, Megan, Anna, that like it's been really helpful to you, and I wanted to share that it's been helpful to me as well, doing exposure on my own anxiety, even though it's not from an OCD context. But it was like helpful to kind of learn myself for really like helping clients tease some things out a little bit. And so I used to experience a lot of anxiety about food. Like, what if I have a negative sensory experience eating a food? And I think I would not recommend someone try to do exposure for sensory sensitivities. Like, try to eat food that really bugs you to get better. I mean, maybe there are some people who feel okay about that, but that's not my personal style. But I was able to tease out the sensory versus the what if anxiety about having an experience and do exposure to that.
I love that.
I feel like that made me even like more autistic, like meet my autistic needs even better, because I was practicing facing that what if and the uncomfortable feelings of the anxiety that came up when I was doing it. And then I was able to find more same foods and more foods I liked and what my actual autistic preferences are around food, like, and actually meet my needs better because I was exploring it.
Oh, that's so interesting. So in working through the anxiety, you were actually able to better meet your sensory needs.
Yes.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So how did you, because I get this question a lot, because I talk about this too, the importance of teasing out anxiety versus sensory, because we don't want to do an exposure to sensory stuff. How did you walk yourself through teasing out, I think this is a what if anxiety thing versus I think this is a sensory thing?
Yeah. I think paying attention a little bit, sometimes people will say in ERP, the content doesn't matter, quote unquote, like the thoughts don't matter. And we can talk more about that because I think that's a really cruel thing to say to someone, especially autistic people.
Your thoughts don't matter.
Yeah.
Or so we test your thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like a lot of who we are, our values, our thoughts.
Yeah.
And so I really don't like that kind of frame. That's another way we can adapt. Don't say that to people. Just because ERP is a behavioral model doesn't mean we can't look at the thoughts. And the thoughts are going to tell us what's anxiety. So like what if, or any kind of future oriented thought kind of points to, that's not a sensory sensitivity. That's anxiety. And then, but also just like, you know how in ACT is like turning towards the feeling, whatever that feeling is, to be with it. So in turning towards the feelings that come up when I was eating, I could say, okay, this feels like something I don't like in my mouth, not something I don't like because my heart is racing, because my muscles are tense. Like tuning in. It's really hard to do with alexithymia.
I was going to ask you about alexithymia because I'm like, that's really precise self-awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
I do
how
have
did you
alexithymia.
do
Yeah.
that? How did you do that with alexithymia? Were you
Yeah.
well, yeah, I know for me, I track a lot of my behaviors and my
hmm
thoughts because the
Yeah.
feelings are harder. So
Definitely.
that's my access point to like figuring out how I'm feeling or doing with it. Is that similar to what you did or?
Yeah, I would say so. Like having a sense of, I kind of like do this with clients too with the SUD scale. Sometimes people use the SUD scale with ERP to see like
And we'll just
subjective.
break that. SUD scale is, do you want to unpack that real quick?
Oh yeah, the subjective units of distress. So
Yeah.
how distressed are you from 0 to 10 scale? But it can be really hard for clients with alexithymia to rank something with a number or a word.
Totally. And it's often like I'm 1 or 2 or I'm 10 because we don't feel that slow creep, which is why this is actually one of the reasons people with alexithymia can often look like they have borderline personality disorder because of those extreme, like emotional, it looks like an extreme emotional reaction because it's like, well, I'm fine and then I'm not fine versus like that middle ground. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
So we can really like break that down for people. Like, what does this look like on the outside at a 10, a 5, a 0?
Yes. What are you
And
doing? What are you thinking? Absolutely. Yeah, I
or
really like doing that.
external.
Mhm.
And then
Yeah.
mapping that with some internal things until people get more comfortable and you can kind of grow your awareness if you want to. And that's the other piece is like the SUD scale is helpful. We can use it in ERP, but we don't have to. And that's another piece of adapting. If something's not working, just like check it. We don't need
Yeah.
it. I think people get really hung up on SUDs because of the idea of like habituation
Mm.
in exposure, like the idea that we're supposed to like keep exposing ourselves to anxiety until we feel less and less and less of it. And that's like what success looks like in ERP. But that's an older model. And the newer model is more about inhibitory learning. And we don't need to like measure our SUDs and watch them go down. If we're measuring our goals more in an inhibitory learning way of like, how are we living with this feeling instead of, is it going away?
Oh, yeah, I hear the ACT in that because it's like, so there's, I really like, there's an exercise from ACT called the Matrix, and it talks
Mm,
about the inside out trap of like, oh gosh, okay, I cannot unpack this with words. But the idea is we often get stuck with, I can't move toward what's important to me. I can't move toward my values while I have these
mm,
negative feelings inside. And that's often the measure of success, which is kind of what you're saying with the SUDs, the SUDs.
yeah.
Is it pronounced SUDS? Not okay. With the SUDS, is that it's measuring like the distress versus how much are you moving toward what's important to you.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. So like, and so with the inside out trap, where it's like, well, I can't move toward friendship until I feel better about this part of my life. It would be like, I can feel anxiety and move toward friendship and move toward socializing. So it's taking that I can feel this thing and move toward this thing.
That's really how I would describe ERP in general.
Mm.
Like sometimes people are talking about ACT or ACT from ERP, and it's kind of like, are these all things all synonymous? Because that is exactly how I would describe it, like moving towards something you value with the feeling and turning towards that feeling and turning towards your values at the same time. And paradoxically, it does
Yeah.
tend to lead to habituation, but
Yeah.
that's the goal.
Yeah. And I think this is really hard for a lot of neurodivergent people. There's been some research out there that many of us, especially with alexithymia, we tend to cope through emotional avoidance. And this
Yeah.
requires, and you were saying how doing the exposure work on yourself is really hard. I've also done a
Yeah.
lot of exposure on my anxiety. It
Yeah.
is really hard because you're looking at the emotion, you're sitting with it. It is the opposite of emotional avoidance. And many of
Mm.
us, for understandable reasons, have coped with our overwhelm through emotional avoidance. So it can also feel really vulnerable to start one of these approaches where all of a sudden we're relating to our emotions very differently.
Absolutely.
Kind of talked about that, Megan, in our first like intro episode for OCD.
Mm.
When we talked about exposure, a lot of people can view exposure therapy as like a last resort.
Mm.
Like, I am
Mm.
so desperate for this to be different or for this to no longer impact me in this way. and how there's such a level of vulnerability to saying that and placing yourself in a position where a lot is going to come up, comparatively to just talk therapy or,
Mhm.
and I like what you're saying, Aiden, about kind of individualizing this and moving towards values makes so much more sense as opposed to saying like, there's going to be this almost rigidity-like process of
Right.
extremism in a way.
Yeah, I really do see that. I think that critique is really valid when people are talking about some exposure therapists being pretty rigid and extreme. I've definitely been in trainings, conferences where people are advocating for that. Like, kind of have this bravado almost of like, we're ERP therapists. We're going to lick the toilet. Like, it's not an episode of Fear Factor. We don't need to be extreme and we don't need to like go up a hierarchy in a rigid way. That's another piece of this change in model from habituation to inhibitory learning is they're showing good outcomes can come without going up in a rigid way of a hierarchy.
Can you unpack inhibitory learning real quick? Just because I think that's a mouthful.
Yes, definitely. So inhibitory learning is about making new connections and new associations. It's not necessarily about getting rid of the old ones, like unlearning, not necessarily unlearning fear, but learning safety on top of fear. So basically, like if you were to touch a hot stove as a kid, your brain would generalize automatically, don't touch hot stoves. That's a really protective thing we need. And in order to become feel safe again, touching hot stoves, you would have to like approach that and have a new association, new learning come and then not be burned over and over again, probably in different situations and at different times, so that you can form a new understanding and like a new neural connections around safety. And it doesn't necessarily have to replace the old ones, but create new ones. And I think so that's like kind of the process of inhibitory learning, but it's also just like a shift in how we're talking about OCD away from this kind of older model into this newer model.
That feels way more empowering me to think about, okay, I can create new neural pathways here versus I have to unlearn something that I've got like years of like rigid, like neural ridges around. And again, it holds the both and. Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of want to backtrack. I kind of want to go back to exposure because I feel like this is a pretty like foundational idea. Can we just talk about why exposure works for anxiety? Because I think so that exposure does not work for sensory sensitivities.
Right.
And I think that's where this idea that like exposure doesn't work for autistic people, we're talking about a very like specific part of the autistic experience. So can we just talk about exposure a little bit, like what it is, why it works for anxiety?
Yeah, it's a really good place to be. So in ERP, we conceptualize the OCD cycle as like there's a trigger and then experience intrusive or obsessional thinking that's distressing, causes anxiety or distress. And then we have a compulsion come right in after that in order to relieve the distress, which kind of gives some temporary relief or just like a little bit, which kind of reinforces the whole cycle because, okay, that worked a little bit. Of course, you're going to try again and again and again. That's kind of the OCD cycle. And then exposure kind of interrupts that cycle. As behavioral therapy, we pick to interrupt it at the place of compulsion. That's kind of one of the things that makes it different from ICBT, is it's more behavioral and less cognitive. So instead of doing the compulsion, we practice staying with the emotion and whatever that is, distress, anxiety. And in doing so, we have that new learning that happens where we can't blame our safety on the compulsion. We can actually learn safety elsewhere. So let's say, and I'm going to give an example of something related to harm OCD, just because I think a lot of times people talk about OCD with like contamination or hand washing. But that's so not what it is so much of the time that I like to use a more common example like harm. So let's say someone's really, I'll give like a really autistic affirming example too. So let's say someone's special interest or intense interest is cooking and they really love being experimental in the kitchen and all of that. But then OCD kind of comes to that area of their life and they become really afraid of harming someone or themselves with a knife in the kitchen. So
I've literally had this. I've had this before. Yeah.
common, really common.
Yep.
And so then the compulsions can be to avoid being in the kitchen or to avoid knives or clench your fists really tight so you don't pick up the knife or something like that. And then if you were to cook that way and go through the OCD cycle, you get to attribute safety to the fact that you did those compulsions. Like I was safe, I didn't murder anyone because my fists were clenched.
Right. So it's very reinforcing because it's like, it worked. I was safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a confirmation bias there, but it's there. And it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And then in ERP, when we're doing the exposure and we're kind of in a slice through the cycle, that would mean in that example, like maybe at first just standing in the doorway of the kitchen. We don't need to get too intense, like we were saying before. It's just about practicing turning towards the emotion without the compulsion. So you practice standing in the doorway and feeling the feelings that come up when doing that and not engaging in the compulsions. And then because of that, you get to learn like, oh, I'm safe. I didn't murder anyone. I kind of learn by doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's so much strength and like, I think a reclaiming of agency that I've seen with that. Of like both like I can survive hard emotions.
Yes.
But also like this thing I fear didn't actually happen. Yeah.
Right.
So it's something I talk about a lot is I think that the autistic experience, I think we lose a lot of trust with ourselves for a lot of reasons. One, because a lot of our like sensory experiences throughout our whole life have been invalidated and a lot of our ways of socializing have been invalidated. So we experience a lot of loss in our self-trust. And when we can do that sort of exposure, what you're describing it, doing it well, not the kind where we're just flooding ourselves and shutting down, then it rebuilds self-trust, which I think really is so powerful for anybody, but especially for those of us who have kind of had self-trust eroded through our lives.
Absolutely. And I appreciate how you're saying it's not just about showing that the bad thing won't happen. It's also showing that you can handle the hard feelings that come up because we don't have 100% certainty that nothing bad will ever happen.
Yes. Have you read, there's my favorite book on anxiety I read, and I read it, so I had pretty significant postpartum anxiety, and my OCD started flaring during that time. And it lasted the whole time I was nursing, and I nursed for 2 years because I read a thing about like, I was doing the autistic thing of like, these are the rules, you're supposed to nurse this long. Anyways, I had the whole time I was like hormonally in that period, I had postpartum anxiety, which was years for me because, and my favorite book I read, I always mess up the title, maybe you know it, Everything Might Go Terribly, Horribly Wrong, but It's Okay. It's by one of the big ACT people, but I love it because it's about like, things might go really, really wrong. And how do we live? How do we live a good life? In the face of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Exposure is so about that. Ideally, it's like helping us move towards what we really value, what really matters to us, and not about licking toilet seats for no reason. No one ever is going to need to lick a toilet seat. It's just not practical.
Listen, okay, so that's... Oh, go ahead, Patrick.
It's just like a very stupid joke, but I was just in Italy and the toilet seats are disgusting. So that's just that image in itself is just horrifying to me. With your example, Aiden, like stepping into the kitchen, right? The next step might be like opening the fridge door and like you're tracking the SUDS, the subjective units of distress the entire time and just paying attention to what's coming up.
You can, you don't have to. Whatever way makes it accessible to someone to tune in and to not engage in the compulsion, we're going to go with that. You can track SUDS if that helps you tune in. Personally, I think that can kind of take away from them being present in the moment, which is what we're trying to do, is be present with whatever comes.
Yeah, tracking the units for me never really worked. We used to incorporate a lot of that with addiction work as well. And with when you're having any sort of impulse or urge or craving and then tracking that unit, I'm like, for me, that's not really how this is working. I'd much rather pay attention to what's coming up for me. What am I experiencing and how am I supporting myself throughout that process? And I think that always worked a little bit better for myself.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
Sorry, Megan, I don't know if you lost your thought, but I cut you off.
Oh, I think I wanted to, so, okay, not licking toilet seats. That's one way you adapt ERP for autistic people. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about how, I hear the infusion of ACT versus like ERP is kind of often I've always thought of it as a more classic CBT approach. So I hear the kind of, you're bringing in ACT to bring in values, but I'm curious other ways that you're adapting it to be more neurodivergent affirming.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about accommodating sensory needs in exposure as being really crucial in that way.
Absolutely. Yes.
Someone wants to do an exposure that's outside of the house, but it's really noisy. Bring your headphones along, bring your fidgets along. Like, I don't think that a lot of like exposure isn't taught alongside accommodation because accommodation for anxiety doesn't tend to work, right? Like if we could just reassure, and I think a lot of people will identify with this. If you say like, don't worry about it, it's fine, you'll be fine. Like that doesn't work, doesn't go anywhere. And that kind of falls in the accommodation bucket. So I think not every ERP therapist is thinking, okay, how do we accommodate in these areas without accommodating in other areas?
And can I interrupt you and break that down a little bit? Because I think accommodation is so known in autistic ADHD space as like a good thing. So I just want to unpack like accommodation for anxiety. When that's talked about, when we have anxiety, there's a lot of things we do to accommodate the anxiety. I kind of think of it as like you're giving more power to the anxiety. So like, and then family systems will often do it. So like, I'll give an example that I've got permission to share. One of my children who had OCD related to her veganism, the whole family started accommodating that. Like I've got some like leather shoes. Sorry, I bought them before I was vegan. Please don't hate me. But I have some leather items, and that was becoming like an OCD trigger. So over time, like the whole family started eating vegan, even though like we're all vegetarian, but we all started eating vegan because like the presence of cheese was so distressing, or if anyone had touched milk and then touched something. So our whole family system was accommodating the anxiety. That's not good for anxiety because then like you go from a home that's like sterile, there's nothing, to school, and there's triggers all over the place. So when we're talking about accommodating anxiety, I kind of think of it as like the ways we're adjusting our behavior that give the anxiety more space to take over. I don't know. Feel free to correct my definition, but so with anxiety, it's like accommodation of anxiety tends to be seen as counterproductive, unhelpful. Accommodation of like sensory stuff, executive functioning, this is good. So then when you're working with an ADHD or an autistic person with anxiety, it's like, okay, we want to identify what's the executive functioning struggle that's causing stress, and we want to accommodate that. What's the sensory thing causing stress? We want to accommodate that. What's the anxiety? We want to actually lower accommodations or But and that gets, I think that's confusing for probably non-clinicians. It's like, what?
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And we would accommodate it and be fine to accommodate if it worked or was helpful or reduced anxiety. Like if it was ever helpful to accommodate by saying, don't worry about it, like you'll be fine. If that was ever helpful, fine. If it's one and done, great. But it tends to be that like your experience with the veganism, first it's like, everyone has to be vegan, then things can't touch. Like it just grows and grows. The anxiety is so big that it really takes over and can bring people away from their values and away from the life they want to live.
Yeah, exactly. I think I saw this in like a children's book. I've always loved it. It's like feeding the anxiety monster. Like every time you do that, and then it gets bigger and it takes over more of your house and more of your emotional space. And I've certainly experienced that personally as well, of like where I've fed the anxiety through avoidance or through accommodation, and then it's taken up a lot of space in my life.
Absolutely. I think similarly in terms of accommodations, like really letting clients know what to expect from the process.
Mhm.
Again, with that kind of stereotype of ERP clinicians, it's like ready to go. And it might look like an accommodation for anxiety to let people know what to expect. If you're kind of not understanding that as a processing need. I really like to let clients know, like, this is what the building looks like that you're going to be coming into. This is what my office looks like. These are some of the things we're going to talk about in the first session, like really giving a sense of what to expect, because it is really hard work to do exposures and to feel feelings, no matter how small we make it and friendly we make it. It's hard. So letting people know what to expect is really helpful. And I don't see that as an anxiety accommodation. I see that as a processing need, because if someone sends me a picture of the therapy office ahead of time, that means it's less visual processing for me to do in the moment, and I can be more present.
Yeah. You're also making the ERP more effective because it's like, we're going to use your resources for the exposure that is important, not for like navigating a new space or figuring out how am I supposed to approach this space or what's coming, like what to expect. I love that. Yeah. You're accommodating our communication style and our processing. That's,
Right.
that's a great one.
And it helps us stay in the window of tolerance enough to learn from the exposure. Like you were saying before about flooding, it's not helpful for exposure.
Mm-mm.
If it happens, things do happen. And it's not our goal to flood someone, because you're not really creating a lot of new connections when you're flooded. There's less learning happening during a panic attack than when you're more regulated and feeling things in a more manageable way.
I'm so glad you said that because it's not like all exposure is good. Like if it's the
Yeah,
kind of exposure where you're not doing that good neural like learning, then that's actually counterproductive. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then people have a really bad experience. They don't want to try again.
Mhm. Part of what I'm hearing, so this is my psychodynamic brain coming out, but part of what I'm hearing is you create a really, really sturdy frame for autistic clients to go through ERP. And the frame is so important because what they're doing is incredibly hard.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
Great summation, Megan. Wow.
Um, okay. So you adapt for like communication and processing. Are there other things that you do that's different than kind of classic ERP?
Yeah, I know you were saying earlier about this idea of not saying things that are really invalidating. And this is like basic stuff that I think we should be doing for everyone, not just autistic clients, but um, like I have heard and been in some trainings where people will say, oh, like thoughts are garbage. Don't pay attention to thoughts. And that can be incredibly disempowering to hear someone say. I think the reason that people say that is because it's behavioral. We're more about standing in the doorway than we are about thinking about what kind of thoughts you're having while you're standing in the doorway.
Like just do the thing. Don't worry about the thoughts. Okay.
Yeah, so I think they're trying to encourage that maybe, or trying to prevent people from doing a compulsion in the therapy session by ruminating on the
Mhm.
thoughts out loud to the therapist. But it can feel really
Oh,
horrible.
yeah. Because the thoughts are causing pain. Yeah. Yeah. I'll be curious to your thoughts on this because I do this a lot with my mind, and I
Mm,
certainly taught people this, like kind of the act idea of, the brain, the mind is like a thought making machine, and thoughts are thoughts. Like it's a produce of your mind. So I will do a lot of like unhooking from my thoughts of like, oh wow, Megan, that's a painful thought you just had. I'm not dismissing it, but I am like, I'm not also being like, because I'm thinking that thing, therefore it's true.
right.
And I'm actively working to unhook myself from the thought. Is that still something you do while also validating that thoughts are hard and
Yeah, exactly. We can validate them. We can have compassion for them and how hard they are. And if a client has a story about where that came from, like a trauma, where they
Mhm.
developed that thinking pattern, we can have so much compassion for that. And then unhooking is response prevention. So when you get hooked on a thought and you start ruminating and thinking about it over and over again, or trying to solve it or figure it out, or kind of be in the thought, that's a compulsion, a mental compulsion. Um,
Mm. Hmm.
and when we unhook from thoughts, or like diffuse from thoughts, that's response prevention. We're not letting the cycle complete. We're staying with the distress. We're staying with the experience without
Mhm.
trying to fix it or solve it, which is what you're doing when you get hooked on your thoughts.
Mhm. Mhm. So that I like what you're bringing in there too, like unhooking from the thoughts, but not in a way of like emotionally avoiding.
Right.
Oh, that is tricky. Because yeah, it could be tempting to be like, okay, I'm having this thought. I'm going to practice some. And for those listening, diffusion, I feel like like made a bunch of complex language to like to probably to create a culture, but sometimes I don't know how helpful it is. So diffusion is when you unhook. I think of it, the metaphor I often use when you're hooked on a thought, like if you've ever worn sunglasses with like blue tinted or red tinted sunglasses and you see the whole world is blue or red. When we're hooked on a thought, that's kind of how I see the thought. It's like it's influencing how we're seeing everything. It feels very real. And then I think of unhooking as kind of like you're taking off the sunglasses and holding them. And it's like, okay, you're still there. I see you. I also am not seeing the world through you. Maybe that just adds more confusion, but it's a way of getting some distance from the thought and observing it. Like we're bringing an observing mind to be like, oh, hi there, thought, versus being, in the thought.
Right.
And I lost my stream of thought, but I think, so yeah, to be able to do that, I could see how that could also become an emotional avoiding tactic.
Mhm.
I think I've probably used it that way at times of like, I'm unhooking from you, but to be able to stay present to, and this is a hard moment. This is the emotion coming up for me.
Yeah, and we can unhook without running a mile away from the thought. Just kind of like a spectrum between being in the thought and thinking it actively and kind of contending with it, giving it power, versus kind of like letting it stay, letting it hang out while you attend to what matters to you.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's see, like, sometimes I like to kind of explain it as like burners on a stove. Like the thought comes up, it's on the front burner, you're kind of cooking with it, you're mixing the water or whatever. And diffusing is kind of like putting that pan on the back burner. So it's still there. You're not avoiding it. You're not shoving it out of the room and running a mile away. It's there, it's boiling, it's doing whatever it's doing. But whatever's on the front burner, the next dish you're cooking or whatever is where you're focused on. And that's whatever is of value to you.
Oh, I like that metaphor. I haven't heard that one. So it's like I'm going to put you in the background and like this is what's important to me. And that's again doing that like instead of getting pulled into the inside out trap of like I can't do this thing until this is off the stove completely, which again was like a lot of us do have all or nothing thinking. So I know I fall into that a lot of I just wrote a newsletter about this of how like I'm in middle of revisions on my next book, and that's a cumbersome process, but it's also like this sense of I can't do anything until that's off my plate. I can't like do the things like go on a walk, things that I know would be healthy for me. Or so I do that with tasks, but I also just do it with life in general. Like I can't do this thing until this thing is done. Or with emotions, I can't do this thing until this emotion is taken care of. And I think because our brains, I think, do tend to have more all or nothing thinking, I think we can fall into those traps quite often.
Yeah. And it's just a way to practice doing things a little differently and seeing how that works or doesn't work. Or
Yeah. I got this from Dr. Jonathan Dalton, and I know you know his work too. He does a lot with anxiety and kids and school avoidance. And something he teaches kids is like, I can be anxious and then fill in the blank. And I love that exercise. Like I can be anxious and then whatever the activity is.
Also thinking about another place of adapting in terms of like another one where it's just good ERP in general, but also happens to work really well for autistic folks is not being coercive. And unfortunately, I have heard people say that they've had coercive experiences in ERP where therapists have pushed them in ways that they didn't want to be pushed, or used rewards or something like that in order to enforce behaviors. And I think autistic clients are even more sensitive for very good reason to the use of rewards. And rewards just doesn't have a place in ERP personally. I wasn't taught that way, but I do see people suggesting it because it's kind of in that behavioralism category.
Yeah. Sorry, I laughed because I was like, that just feels so obvious, but you're right. It's absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely. And so I just finished up I did a course in my community on the interest-based nervous system. And so we did like a 6-week experiment where we went through the motivators pinch. So passion, interest, novelty. Okay, I'm doing the thing where I'm sharing too much context. Okay, top down thinking. I can do this. So anyways, one of the things that came up that I thought was so interesting and I loved was we realized if we like infuse a task with play, or with competition, if we do it in a way where we know we're like trying to manipulate ourselves, it tends to backfire. Like I think we're so sensitive to manipulation, even if it comes from ourselves, versus kind of what we settled on is it's like, well, I'm gonna do this task. I might as well infuse some playfulness in it versus I'm going to make this playful to get myself to do the thing. So I think we're so sensitive to manipulation, including self-manipulation.
Yeah.
So I would see why that kind of classic approach would really backfire if it feels at all manipulative. Again, even if we're doing self-manipulation, like that still pulls a big response for a lot of us.
Absolutely. And I think that's another like reason to do natural exposures versus planned or kind of fabricated exposures. Sure, it's good to practice in therapy sessions doing exposures so people feel more confident doing them at home themselves. So a little bit of like trying to do something on purpose can be helpful. But I really like having more of a natural exposure, like doing response prevention in your everyday life. That's exposure. We don't need to go hunting or creating elaborate scenes or imagining certain things happening. Like life is full of the opportunity for exposure. We experience anxiety all the time. We don't need to like manipulate or set up this kind of like scheme to practice this kind of stuff. We can weave it in pretty naturally.
That's a really good point. I have a question. I'm just thinking out loud because of the amount of time that I spend traveling. Exposure for travel, especially air travel. I know a lot of people who have intense fear, whether it be for anxiety, whether it be phobic in general, but in order to make that experience more neurodivergent affirming, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud. I assume like fidget toys, noise canceling headphones, like all the sensory things that we can think of, because those experiences are just sensory overload in magnified times a million. And then bring into the fact like the intense panic or phobic fear or anxiety of that experience. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think accommodating in all those ways, and even like some things around processing ahead of time, like maybe you want to look at a map of the airport ahead of the time, or planning kind of contingency plans, like, okay, if this doesn't go well, what am I going to do next? So that some of that processing demand is lower when you're actually there. But you are doing the hard thing, facing fears, and also the hard thing of being in an airport.
Yes.
So all of that. And then, whatever kind of entry point is accessible to the person. So someone might experience flight anxiety just going on like a website to book a flight. Okay, so let's practice that a couple of times. Let's practice feeling that feeling and whatever comes up doing that without going away really quick and closing the tab really quickly or whatever that is. Like we can have a really quick or minor experience of that just to get confidence and practice to get started.
Yeah, I like that. I like the quick, easy entry points that don't feel so like don't dive off the deep end situations. Like don't just go jump on a flight with someone and just, try to force yourself through that experience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to help. And it's also practical because one of the actual steps of going on a flight is looking at the website.
Yep.
It's not just, I think sometimes we really need like the why to do something. It's not a rule for rule's sake. We're not just going to do something as we should or the therapist says or whatever. It has to be practical and realistic. So that's like a step in the actual process.
Absolutely.
That also makes sense with natural exposures, like because the exposure has to make sense. It has to be connected to a why. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think I actually shared this on the first episode, and maybe you can correct me. And this is because this is probably classic ERP. The idea being that with the exposure, you have to kind of overshoot the natural triggers that would show up in day-to-day life. And I think I understand the thinking, because you're kind of like, if you've done that, then these are going to be less stressful, is maybe the logic. But I get the sense that's actually not how you work.
It isn't how I work, unless someone wants to, and that's great. Like, some people do want to. They really want to like grab OCD up by the roots and pull it completely out, and that's fine. Let's
I
go.
mean, that
Let's do
sounds
it.
nice. I wouldn't mind that if someone wanted to do that to my brain.
Far, yeah. And so, like going that far past is totally a thing we can do, and I don't think we need to be afraid of doing it. It's kind of client preference personally. I have heard like lived experience stories of people really benefiting from that because later down the road, something bigger did show up, and they were glad that they did that. And okay, something bigger comes down the road later. That will be the exposure then. It's okay.
Maybe like as autistic ADHD humans, we just create enough like big exposures ourselves that we don't need to overshoot, because like our lives are just filled with.
I think it depends on just
Yeah.
what's practical and what's going to actually help you achieve your actual goals. Like sometimes overcorrecting, okay, but is that actually going to make any difference in your life? Maybe not. That we can kind of be flexible there about whether we do that or not.
So like a lot of self-determination in this process too, of like, really, what do you
Yeah.
want out of this experience, opposed to like, this is what we are going to do, and I'm going to drive that ship as the therapist. And I think that makes a lot more sense for people to just say, this is kind of what I'm targeting. This is what I want to have happen, instead of, again, going back to the all or nothing.
Right.
Thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
We can still be like client led and centered, even though it's a behavioral therapy. And I think we forget that sometimes.
Sure.
Yeah, it sounds like you do a lot to really connect to the client's why, like of like what is your outcome, like what that you desire, like why is this important to you? And again, I think doing something that it is exposure is hard, like, then especially for those of us who need things like knowing why I need to wear a certain piece of clothing is like, I need to know the why. Like, so to do something like exposure, we really need to feel pretty connected to the why. And that is something that's striking me as I hear you talk, is about how much you really do to connect to the why for your clients.
The other risk is if we don't connect to the why or have something like that, we can really enforce behavioral norms kind of arbitrarily. Be a lot of harm there. Like sometimes I'll see people in like ERP Facebook groups posting about like, well, what do you do when you're opening a soda can? Do you clean off the top, or what's normal? And I don't really personally care what's normal. I care what the client wants. Like, I'm not trying to make everyone clean or not clean a soda can. I personally don't care. But if that's bothering the client, that they have to clean it and it's an extra step in their day, they don't want to. They want to be able to face that anxiety, or it's taking too much time or mental energy. Great, let's work on that. But I'm not in the business of enforcing behavioral norms oppressively.
That's a great tagline for this episode. I'm not in the business of enforcing behavioral norms.
Something, and the title can be something about you don't have to lick the toilet.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Unless your goal is to be a toilet licking taste tester, I don't know. Great, sure, let's do it.
The first time I heard that, it was from I was a clinical mentor, because ERP is not something I've done. And I had a clinical trainee in my clinical group who was at an ERP site. And the first time she told me like this was an intervention that she'd done, I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Like this is actually a thing?
Bye.
I told you in our first episode, like my grad school professor was huge into CBT and all things CBT, and talked about exposure all the time. And this is stuff he would do with clients constantly: licking toilet seats in the mall, or taking them on short 30-minute airplane flights, like back and forth. And I just thinking like, this makes me horrified. Like this is not comfortable for me.
No.
Mm-hmm. And this is where I really love that we've had you on, Aiden, because I think those stories get out there about exposure, like all of the really negative things about exposure. But then I think we might be, if that narrative is dominant in autistic space, then we might actually be encouraging emotional avoidance, because exposure is really important to anxiety. And a lot of us, there's been some studies. There's one study, I think it was teens. It was like 90%. I'd want to look it up, but it was around like I think it was as much as 90% of autistic teens had at least one anxiety disorder. It's just,
It's right
I've
there.
yet to meet an autistic person who has not had anxiety.
Yeah.
If you're out there listening and you're
Autistic and never have
No,
had anxiety,
experience
and not like
no.
not help. Like there's like helpful anxiety,
Sure.
and then there's like pathological or disordered
Yeah.
anxiety where it's like this is no longer helpful.
Yeah. If that's you, please send us a message.
Tell us.
Love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think it's great to be able to have share some positives that can come from this, because I really have seen so many clients really get closer to their special interests, closer to their sensory preferences, closer to who they are, who they want to be, and how they want to interact in the world through ERP.
Right.
It really can be such a positive thing for people. So to be hearing more of those stories of negativity, not that I don't like discount that at all. I think we really need to reckon with that in the field, but to have some positive as well. And I think ERP is so well suited for autistic people in some ways that I think we forget about. Like learning by doing can be so powerful. To be able to see, oh my gosh, yesterday I couldn't do that, and today I can. Like yesterday I couldn't drive to D&D group or whatever because I was afraid I might harm someone while driving. And today I got in the car and I went there and I actually played and I had a good time. Like to be able to see that is so cool.
It's
So
life-changing.
empowering. Yeah.
So empowering.
I like that we are dispelling and disputing, like I said before, about EMDR as well in this situation, because it's so good to hear the other perspectives opposed to like these blanket statements that just get thrown out there of how extreme things can be when people have bad experiences and when their experiences are not neurodivergent affirming. So really cool.
Yes. I am eager for a day where it's a little bit easier to find
Mhm.
neurodivergent affirming OCD providers. I have
Me too.
that's been a very real struggle. And I feel like we've found the people that exist and like they're coming on the podcast, but like I really would love to start seeing, well, just personally, I think
Sure.
it's so badly needed.
So needed. It really is.
Are we at that point? I'm reading the room and the energy, so
Is there anything, Aiden, that we haven't talked about that you're like, oh, this itches in the back of my head
Mm.
of like, this was a thing I thought I wanted to share?
I mean, I could talk about this for so many hours. But I think that we got all of the major parts. It can really require a lot of teasing out, and not just the sensory sensitivity versus anxiety, but like echolalia, stimming, scripting. Like there's so many things that people mistake in either direction. They can require a lot of teasing out. And like I really encourage people to self-advocate as much as they can. Like if you think your therapist is trying to do exposure on something that you're not, you think that's an autistic trait. That's not something I want to be doing exposure on. Try to speak up if you feel safe to do so, or find someone if you can who is more affirming, because there's a lot to tease out. Even like respect for routines. Like we need our routines. It helps with our executive function. And really don't want people to mistake that for anxiety or OCD.
It's a great point.
And this kind of brings us back to the beginning of the hour around self-awareness. Like, so I think so much of this work, because anxiety does often kind of hook on and intertwine with like sensory stuff or routine stuff, or can look like. So much of this does come back to self-awareness around, what is this experience I'm having? Like, is this routine disruption? Like I get a lot of free-floating anxiety around routine disruption. So is it that versus is it, that more forward future thinking of like what might happen, what if? And so really figuring out how to like the inroads to our inner worlds, which might not be feeling based. It might be tracking thoughts, tracking behaviors. That just feels really foundational to any work we do with anxiety, is developing language to understand our own experience. And then to be, I think it also takes the ability to be a mindful, non-judgmental observer of our own experience. And so many of us are very judgmental about our experiences. So that skill feels so foundational here.
Judgment's really big because there can be a lot of internalized ableism or internalized ableism on behalf of the therapist. Of like, okay, so you have these needs, but are we going to be non-judgmental towards those needs and set goals that are coming from a place of genuine value and desire, not from judgment or criticism or anything like that.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure lots of people are going to want to work with you as a therapist after this. I'm guessing you're pretty full.
I am. But I really do love consulting with therapists. So
Okay.
if someone wants to become more like competent in ERP or ACT-informed ERP and wants to get in touch and then spread it wider so you can have more.
That's really, I love that you're doing consultation because that's what we need is, and I think a lot of therapists working with neurodivergent clients are starting to realize like, oh, I need to figure out OCD. So that's great.
For sure. Were you about to say what I'm about to say?
Yes.
I'm Meld. So you said you wanted us to hold you accountable to sharing what you're working on. So here's your time to do that.
Thank you. Yeah. My friend Sharon Aguilar and she has lived experience with OCD and ADHD. And she and I are working on a training right now, a recording, so that people can have an intro to ERP through an ACT lens with all this neurodivergent-affirming stuff really baked in so that people can learn more. All of our case examples are autistic clients' case examples, teasing out what's sensory sensitivity, what's this, what's that. Talking about the accommodations needed to do certain kinds of exposures, like really walking it through piece by piece. I'm really hopeful that more of us can come into this field because it is so needed. And I'm only one person, and I wish I could refer people who are contacting me to like 17 more people at least. Trying to get that information out there.
That sounds like such an incredible training. I am so excited that you're doing that because that's amazing.
It does sound really cool, but the most important part of that is where can people find that?
Yes, people can find that information and contact me through my website, which is divergecounseling.com.
Easy. That will be in the show notes for everyone to have access to Aiden's information and that program. So really great conversation, and thank you for coming on and being interested in having this conversation. And I hope it wasn't as nerve-wracking as it felt prior to starting.
It was a really good exposure for me because it's so connected to my values.
I actually had that thought midway through. I was like, oh yeah, Aiden's doing an exposure right now.
Absolutely.
Circle home. And we'll let you know in a couple of weeks in our OCD series for everyone listening. We still have a couple more great guests who are coming on that we're interviewing in the next couple of weeks as well. For those of you who listen to Divergent Conversations, you can listen every single Friday on all major podcast platforms and YouTube. You can buy Megan's book, Self-Care for Autistic People, which is right behind her right shoulder and on her shelf, anywhere you purchase books. And we will see you next week. I think Megan might jump in and say something before I close this, though.
Oh, I just wasn't expecting that. I was like, oh, wow, thanks for
I was just looking at it the whole time, so I figure people need to continuously know it exists. Because
I know my spouse was like, you never mention your book like in your newsletters or like, he was like, you should do that, right? And I was like, oh, right.
Yeah, that thing.
Thanks for doing it for me, Patrick.
Yeah, of course. Happy to do it. And we will see you next week. Goodbye.